A ka mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Tēnei kātou I raro I te maru o ngā mana whenua, ka te mamoi, waitaha, kai tahu, nau mai, hare mai, tauti mai. Ki te wharaia e tūnei, tū tonu. E nā mate, haere, haere hoki atu rā. Kai oku rakatira, tēnā koutou katoa, Chancellor tēnā koe, ki te Professor Stephenson tēnā koe, e te whānau e te hapu tēnā koutou. Ki te iwi o te Hawaii whā tēnā koutou hui mai tātou katoa. Kia ora, everyone. Kia ora, and for those that don't know me, I'm Richard Blakey, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Research and Enterprise, who on behalf of the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Helen Nicholson, has the pleasure of welcoming you here tonight. Welcome to colleagues, visitors and members of the Dunedin community here in person and online, I understand, to this very, very special occasion for the university where we come together to celebrate the promotion of Professor Janet Stephenson to that position, which is our highest academic position, and hear something of the mahi that has made this happen through her inaugural professorial lecture. This is a celebration, and it's great to see so many distinguished visitors and members of Professor Stephenson's whānau here tonight. Our Chancellor, Professor Dr. Royden Somerville, welcome and thank you for coming tonight. To Janet's husband, Guy, two of your daughters, Anna and Bron, tēnā kaurua, your granddaughter, Etta, you're looking beautiful tonight in the front row, and to your sister, brother and niece joining us here in person, and many others online, nau mai, hara mai, welcome on behalf of the university. Before I begin further proceedings, probably a public service announcement given the news that many of you will have heard tonight. We will be hearing news from government probably at the end of this lecture. But currently we are under alert level 1, but that does mean that we have to take public health precautions seriously, so that for those of you in the university community, if you've got your phone or mobile device on, note and remember that you will contact tracing, if required, will go through the Wi-Fi network. For those who are visitors to the university, we hope you scanned or signed in on your way into the lecture theatre tonight. If you did not do that, please do that on your way out tonight. And as current status permits, we will be gathering for fellowship in the staff club afterwards, but also please follow those normal practices, and of course if there is an alert level change we will recognise that and adapt our plans accordingly. To that, also for this special occasion, please ensure your cell phones are switched off or to silent. We recognise it's probably not the best thing to ask everyone to switch their phones off. If there is a public service announcement, we just have to be prepared to be interrupted for a short time during that, but I think that will likely come at the end of Professor Stephenson's lecture. Okay, so that's the public service announcement out of the way. This is a special occasion, and one where we reflect, as well as in celebration on Professor Stephenson's achievements, on the important contributions we make as a university through our professoriate, through our wider faculty, our students, professional staff and alumni networks. You will hear tonight of the important work Professor Stephenson has led over many years in developing a cultures framework for understanding behaviours and drivers of behaviour changes in energy use, transport and many other areas of sustainability. Work that will be vital as part of our response to the grand challenges of climate change, sustainability and biodiversity that we faced together as a human race. Understanding the drivers of culture change is critical because, as many of us in leadership positions regularly reflect, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Not that a good long-term strategy is not vital, Chancellor. Now, Professor Nell will introduce Professor Stephenson and her talk in more detail, but I want to emphasise first the significance of her promotion to full professor in our university system and the rigour that is involved in that process. We set very high standards here at the University of Otago, and for a research professor like Janet, we require evidence of sustained excellence and leadership in both research and service. We measure this based on the expectations of the best universities in Aotearoa and the rest of the world, and the views of a number of global experts are sought as referees in the process, no fewer than 5 in your case, I see from the file, Janet. All who I'm happy to say strongly recommended you in this well-deserved promotion. Clear from these referee reports, Janet, was the view that we all hold about your efforts, namely that you have undertaken seminal work through which you hold exceptional influence amongst sustainability researchers. I'm quoting here from some of the comments in your referees' reports. That your work offers fresh alternatives to transitioning to a low-carbon energy systems and is increasingly referred to in solutions-oriented approaches to sustainability. And that your service and leadership has been exemplary, with many outstanding examples cited within the university, within national collaborative networks such as the Sustainable Seas National Science Challenges, within governance of national bodies such as NERI, the National Energy Research Institute, and within contributions to the global sustainability research community. I can't end by also noting that you care deeply about people and what you do, evidenced through the success of your students and the warm and welcoming culture and environment in the Centre for Sustainability. So enough said from me. I think Professor Nell will say more in that, but I want to personally thank you for your efforts and the work that is to come, and on behalf of the university, congratulate you on your well-earned promotion. We applaud now. So I now invite Professor Nell, Head of the School of Geography, to formally introduce you and the topic of your lecture.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou. It's a pleasure to be here this evening, and it's a delight to introduce you to Professor Janet Stephenson, who's based at the Centre for Sustainability in the School of Geography. Janet has had a fascinating career, and it's my pleasure to be able to talk very briefly about that career and some of the key things which have happened to bring her to the position where we're so delighted to celebrate her promotion this evening. Janet's work is at the cutting edge of community-engaged science, with a specific focus on how we, as a collective humanity, engage with the daunting environmental and sustainability challenges which the world is experiencing. Challenges which we were once again reminded of in the release last week of the latest IPCC report. As Janet's work over many years has shown, to effect change, scientific knowledge needs to be synthesized with community insights, values, and Indigenous knowledge, drawing on culture to engage in the process of proactive change. Janet's understanding and appreciation of the need to interface environmental and community issues started very young. At the age of 2, she moved with her family from the UK to a farm in New Zealand's North Island. Here, through both the influence of her father, who was an early pioneer in the field of sustainable farming practice, and her engagement with local Maori community, a lifelong interest in culture and environment developed. As a young researcher starting off in her career, she describes herself as a barefoot researcher. That's an evocative term which enjoyed widespread currency in the 1970s and 1980s, which describes researchers who left their offices and laboratories and, as Stan Berkey describes, went to learn from and with the people most impacted by decisions made in offices distant to their life worlds. And I think that's certainly a characteristic of Janet's career over many decades. Thereafter followed her move to the Hokianga with her future husband Guy, where she worked as a researcher, a consultant, and for the local district council. It was there that she undertook her master's research, which examined resource management on Maori land. The family moved to Dunedin in 1999, where she held several research and lecturing positions and undertook her PhD on cultural values before moving to work at what is now the Centre for Sustainability. Her PhD work has been widely recognized and adopted internationally. Its key theoretical contribution was in terms of the links it made between society, behavior, and sustainability outcomes. Her 13 years at the centre, most of them as its director, saw her apply her skills and talents to both growing the centre but also focusing its activities on issues as diverse as energy development, local transport, smart grids, community engagement with sea level rise, decarbonisation, and Maori community responses to climate change. Janet's success as an academic is remarkable. Between 2017 and 2020, she raised over $13 million in research funds, and she has led 5 major and 32 other funded projects. Across her career, she has published over 130 peer-reviewed publications. Key achievements include chairing the National Energy Research Institute, being the New Zealand University's representative on the Ministry of Transport's Research Governance Committee, and her collaboration with the Dunedin City Council over many years. At the university, she has made significant contributions to the university's sustainability initiatives, the Maori Strategic Framework, and she has actively supported Maori research. As we shall hear shortly, Janet's work, which is also the focus of the book she is presently writing, seeks to bring together cultural theory, Indigenous knowledge, policy, interdisciplinary research, and sustainability thinking. This work is critical both in New Zealand and at a wider level in terms of its concept, of its engagement with the concept of well-beings, a framework which influences both local government and budgetary planning in New Zealand and in other countries. As such, this work adds to and extends earlier understandings around sustainable livelihoods approaches. These approaches, while acknowledging the value of social and human capital, have more recently taken on board the importance of culture, which is at the heart of Janet's presentation tonight. With these words, I now have the pleasure of inviting Professor Janet Stephenson to present her inaugural professorial lecture, which is entitled Culture and Sustainability. Thank you, Janet.
Ko manga tautari te maunga, ko Waikato te awa, ko Ngāti Pākehā te iwi, ko Stephenson te whānau, no te wautu ahau, ko Janet tōku ingoa. Tuatahi te mihi tēnei ki a koe e Chancellor, Deputy Vice-Chancellors, Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Professor Etienne Nell. O te rania ki a koutou nā rau rangatira mā o te whāriwānanga nei. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Tuarua e mihi kau ana ki te haukainga. E kai tahu ki Otago, ki Puketaraki, ki Moeraki, nā koutou I manaki mātou. I runga I tēnei whenua tūpuna, nō reira he mihi ki a koutou. O te rā e te whare etu nei, koutou nā kānohi ora. E te whānau whānui, kua eki mai nei. Nei rā mihi mahana ki a koutou katoa. Firstly, I greet the leaders of this university, and secondly, warm greetings to the home people of Kaitahu at Otago, Puketaraki and Moeraki who host us on their ancestral land. And special greetings to all of you in the audience, my family, my friends, my colleagues and students from the Centre for Sustainability and elsewhere across the university, sustainability activists, people from Dunedin businesses and organisations, and those of you who are listening in by Zoom. I'm honoured to have you here. Many of you have inspired, supported, and been part of my journey to this point. I want to start, though, with the most critical issue facing humanity as a whole. That is the destabilisation and destruction at local and global scales of the natural systems on which life and well-being depend. And the injustices that flow from this, because these impacts will be experienced most harshly by those who are less advantaged, those younger generations, and those who are not yet born. This is an existential crisis. The evidence is clear. This harm will become locked into our future unless we act immediately and collectively. And taking climate change as just one of those destabilisers, last week we saw the release of the IPCC's 6th assessment report on the physical science of climate change. Despite 3 decades of global political commitments, greenhouse gas emissions have continued to rise. Unless transformative change is achieved within a few years, the world will be more than 1.5 degrees warmer than pre-industrial times by 2040, and possibly sooner by the mid-2030s. We are then in increasingly devastating territory, with likely tipping points into even worse climate extremes. We either have to make rapid and radical changes to how we live, or radical changes will be forced upon us by an unravelling planet. We have a very short window for individual and collective action, not just to maintain and restore environmental systems, but to do this while addressing current and future inequalities, ensuring health and well-being, and developing sustainable livelihoods and resilient communities. But this sustainability transition, as it is commonly called, is hugely challenging. It involves the adoption of different behaviours and technologies, but more than this, it involves the transformation of systems of production and consumption. It requires major adjustments in governance, in how people and organisations think and act, and the beliefs and ideologies that impel them. In other words, it involves cultural change. So my talk tonight is about culture and sustainability. Sustainability because it is the most critical issue facing humanity. Culture because it is fundamentally the cause of the sustainability crisis. Culture because it can lock us into business as usual, and culture because it is potentially a powerful source of change. Being here tonight is an absolute privilege and unexpected because my pathway here has been somewhat unorthodox. I remember when I was awarded my PhD in 2005 thinking that it doesn't get much better than this. But the last 16 years have been an extraordinary time of intellectual challenge, personal growth, and inspiring collaborations with others, both inside and outside of the university, and many of you in this room. One of the most important things I've learned is the power of ideas. Tonight I'm going to tell you the story of an idea that grew from a seemingly small insight to become a theoretical framework that is widely used internationally and applied to an extraordinarily broad array of topics. I love to talk about it because it helps me make sense of the world and because it gives me hope. But first I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got here and how my pre-academic life has shaped my work as an academic. Because even though universities are places of learning, there are many things that one can only learn by living and experiencing. And for me, those learnings are intimately linked with the places that I've lived. My mihi links me to South Waikato, where I spent most of my formative years and where our family still farms. But I was actually born in Cambridge, England, and came to Aotearoa, New Zealand, when I was 2 years old. Our parents worked on several farms before buying, mortgaged to the hilt, our farm at Te Wautu when I was 8. That's me at the left of both of the photos. Our father, enabled by our extraordinarily supportive mother, combined a love for farming with a passion for the environment. He led the establishment of many groundbreaking national initiatives, such as the Kiwitu National Trust, which enables farmers to voluntarily protect their land in perpetuity, and the Farm Environment Awards, which recognise New Zealand's leading farmers in sustainable land management. What I learnt from him could be the topic of the rest of this lecture, but the one thing I want to highlight here was his genius for recognising what I call the gleam of the possible. Farmers aren't usually perceived as being environmentally concerned, but he saw under the rhetoric to the real affinity and concern that many of them had for the land. Through much discussion, and I well remember those endless committee meetings he used to go to, he brought farmers together to work with local government, councils, and others on a whole raft of environmental projects, locally and nationally, most of which are still going strong. His energy and vision still sustain me. In the photo, he's being awarded his honorary doctorate from Waikato University in 2013. After leaving home, and this is me and my brother and sister who are both here in the audience tonight, looking a little different today. After leaving home, my undergraduate studies were a multidisciplinary smorgasbord. I started at Massey in Palmerston North, and somehow the long-suffering University of Auckland let me graduate in the end with a BA in sociology. But in between, I recall papers in biology, chemistry, statistics, economics, psychology, social work, anthropology, and sociology, and probably more. I think this was the beginning of my fascination with interdisciplinary approaches. Alongside my studies, I was heavily involved in community work, or what might be called community activism, working part-time alongside my studies with disadvantaged communities in Palmerston North and Auckland. I learnt the useful concept of being a catalyst for change, bringing people together to realise their common aspirations and supporting them to take the lead. In this part of my life, I was influenced by the Brazilian philosopher and educator Paulo Freire and his methods of reflection, structural analysis, and action to bring about community-driven social change. Heady stuff in one's early 20s. Together with time spent in various forms of social and environmental activism, including with friends at Bastion Point, this cemented my interest in power and equity. And then after graduating, I spent 6 months living in a tumble-down house in Tolaga Bay on the east coast as a barefoot researcher on the impact of industrial forestry on Māori communities, shyly meeting on marae and with Ngāti Porou leaders such as Api Mahuika and Noi Piwharangi. This immersion opened my eyes to the richness of te ao Māori. But love pulled me to a different place. And I moved to Hokianga in the far north to live with Guy, my dear husband, who's in the front row here. There I learned, amongst other things, how to live with no power, no flush toilet, and no phone up a muddy road, how to milk a cow by hand, and how to feed a family on the smell of an oily rag, and how to write submissions and appear at hearings. And later, with 2 small daughters and 2 stepdaughters, I started work as a completely untrained planner for Hokianga County Council and later Far North District Council. I learnt on the job, and although I later did an extramural Masters of Planning, my biggest learning was from the strong communities that I worked with. Hokianga was and still is another stronghold of te ao Māori, and it was there that I started to absorb ways of thinking about people and place that were quite at odds with my Western training. This led to my master's thesis, which took a critical and treaty-centred view of the planning framework for Māori land. Eventually, Guy and I set up a consultancy, with him doing the architectural design and me as a freelance planner. This enabled me to take on new roles, like being an RMA Hearings Commissioner and serving on the Northland Conservation Board. These were interesting and challenging roles and could have led me to a future defined by a particular kind of leadership, but ultimately it was all a bit too limiting. So for this and other reasons, we set off at the end of '99 to move to Dunedin as a family. Here I worked for the first 2 years for the New Zealand Historic Places Trust, and alongside that was invited by Claire Freeman, who's in the audience here, to give a couple of lectures in the Masters of Planning course in Geography. Within a couple of years, I was a professional practice fellow in the department teaching planning papers. But alongside this, I wanted to challenge the unsatisfying way that the heritage and planning sectors dealt with landscape. So I did my PhD on cultural values in landscapes, supervised by Claire and the late and much-loved Ian Smith. What troubled me was that landscape evaluation had become the realm of professionals and fragmented amongst them. The theme of integration across knowledge systems became central to my work from then on. My postgraduate studies in lecturing taught me academic rigour, but my prior experiences helped me see the opportunities for making academia much more accessible to the non-academic world, better at respecting the knowledge and insights of communities, better at listening and communicating, and better at research collaborations. Things moved quickly following my PhD in 2005. Alongside my geography role, Jerry Carrington, who's here in the audience as well, invited me to help with his initiative to bring together academics from across the university interested in energy issues, and I had my first taste of the exciting potential of working with people from many disciplines. By the end of 2008, I had shifted to becoming a full-time researcher at what was then the Centre for the Study of Agriculture, Food and Environment, or CSAFE, invited by Hugh Campbell, who was then the director. Thank you, Hugh, wherever you are. I became the director in 2011, and later that year we named it the Centre for Sustainability. The centre has always been a very special place, and I feel proud to be part of such a supportive and brilliant whānau of staff and students. many of whom are here tonight. Anyway, one of my first projects at the Centre was co-leading a Marsden research program with Henrik Moller. Thank you, Henrik, for that opportunity on the experiences of tangata kaitiaki of coastal Mihinga Kai, and I have continued to do research with Māori communities. And I'm currently involved in a project on kāinga and climate change led by my wonderful colleague, Merata Kawharu. Alongside this, I was also inspired by the idea of applying social science thinking to what was at that time the very technical topic of energy. And this led to research collaborations with Jerry, with Rob Lawson, who's here, Sarah Walton, I'm not sure if you're here, Sarah, and many others in the Energy Cultures research programs. Lots of other funded research followed, included in energy, transport, coastal issues, climate change adaptation, and various other aspects of sustainability transitions. But with all of these, I kept turning to the concept of culture to help understand what was going on. One of the reasons why a cultural approach is helpful is that if you just focus on individuals, it can only take you so far in understanding behaviour and motivations. Although we're individually influenced by our genetics and our personal psychology, humans are fundamentally social animals. We have a strong tendency to align our beliefs and behaviours with those of others. We learn from the families we're brought up in, from our friends, and from our peers. Culture shapes how we live, how we operate as organisations and businesses. So what is culture? If you've been looking at the dense and mystifying definition on the screen, you've probably been wondering where the exit door is. And that's the point. You need to know that this is one of the least obscure definitions of culture, and by an author who I hugely admire. And culture as a concept is, on the face of it, not easy to apply to sustainability problems. Culture is a very old word and had already branched into several meanings before it entered the academic thinking. Over the past 100 years, and particularly over the past 50, it's become a key concept in many social science disciplines and subdisciplines, some of which I've listed here. And for the most part, unfortunately, cultural theory has become so dense and jargon-filled that it is completely mystifying to lay people, as well as academics in other disciplines. And in its everyday sense, culture is equally confusing. You probably use it to mean many seemingly different things without even considering it. You may use it to refer to the fact that other people do things differently from you. That's American culture for you. You might use it to explain why things are important to your identity. That's part of our culture. You might use it to refer to art and performance. Let's go and get a bit of culture. And I often see it used as a kind of metaphorical shrug, meaning, well, that's just how it is. We can't do anything about it. It's hardly surprising that the cultural academic Raymond Williams famously wrote that culture is one of the 2 or 3 most complicated words in the English language. So how can we put this conceptually rich but fragmented idea to work for the sustainability transition? This is a construction I made in 2009 at the start of the first Energy Cultures research program, when we were trying to make sense of the many theories on culture and behaviour. I was looking for a simple but precise way to express an insight I had about culture. The idea of 3 linked stones came to me one night, fully formed. I made it the next morning, and I think it was Rob I showed it to, first with a mix of excitement and embarrassment. Anyway, that is the foundational idea behind what we now call the cultures framework. It was a seemingly small concept that we first applied to trying to understand why businesses and households weren't being as energy efficient as they might, despite all of the financial and health and comfort benefits. But the framework gave us unexpected insights. In an academic sense, it was fruitful. Here's the Energy Cultures team where it all started. Over 7 years, we applied the framework to a range of energy questions and to transport issues, refining as we went and publishing papers in international journals. We wrote our first theoretical paper about it in 2010. We also wrote about the framework as the conceptual glue that helped our interdisciplinary team work together so successfully. And many other papers, some more theoretical, some reporting on our findings. We were very excited when some other research groups around the world started to pick it up and apply it to other sustainability-related issues. Since the Energy Cultures Research Program ended in 2016, I've continued to use and write about the framework in other research projects and with some of my postgraduate students, along with some others from the team. By 2018, it had spread its wings from being the Energy Cultures Framework to simply the Cultures Framework as a generally applicable approach to sustainability problems. And international researchers have kept using it in even more contexts. So it's become a bit viral, to use today's phrase. Just to give you an idea of the range, it has been used to explore building retrofits in Europe, fuel poverty in New Zealand, solar uptake in Switzerland, slum housing in Mumbai, water use in the UK, cultural history in the Black Hills of Dakota, and energy culture in rural Transylvania. I'd really like to know more about that. And I'll be talking about a few other examples soon. I'm currently writing a book to try and haul all of this together. For the sociologists and anthropologists in the audience, the Cultures Framework builds on various fields of social theory, including structuration, habitus, actor network theory, socio-technical systems, social practice, and other cultural theories, as well as systems thinking. The rest of you should be happy that I'm not going to talk about any of that tonight. So, what's the Cultures Framework all about? It started as an integrator of cultural concepts. There were more than 150 definitions of culture in the 1950s, the last time anyone seriously counted, and there will be countless more today. But regardless of the discipline they emerge from, three main types of characteristics keep coming up. Firstly, ways of thinking. The ways that people make sense of, give meaning to, and evaluate the world. This includes their beliefs, values, and norms, their expectations and aspirations about how life should be lived. Secondly, things that people do and how they do them. This includes everyday routines and habits, as well as actions or activities they might do rarely, but are still socially influenced. And thirdly, the things that people make, things they acquire, and things that they have. This includes both physical things like a car or food or an artwork, and non-physical things like software or stories. One way to get your head around culture is to simplify it even further into have, think, and do. The rubber bands show that these don't exist independently, but are strongly linked and tend to align with one another. Many different definitions of culture also mention knowledge, skills, and language. Language includes distinctive ways of communicating, as I am tonight, or particular types of words or expressions used by a group of people. I show these as part of the rubber bands, helping mediate and express how we think, what we do, and what we have. So this is the Cultures Framework, and being academics, if you want to be taken seriously, you have to align with academic culture and therefore use complicated sounding words. So rather than have, think, and do, we talk about materiality, norms, and practices, but they basically mean the same thing. And we turn the rubber bands into linking arrows like so. So the framework is a stripped-down set of core ideas about culture, which, as I will show, has been found to be surprisingly useful for analysing sustainability problems. For something to be called a culture, a group of people or an organisation share a largely similar set of things they have, think, and do. The framework helps us identify patterns of similar cultural characteristics across a population and then see how these relate to sustainability outcomes. For example, studies in New Zealand and Italy have identified groups of households with cultural characteristics that are associated with greater or lesser energy efficiency. But as you'll see from other examples I'll use, you can use the framework with anything sustainability related, for example, to do with the environment, human well-being, or livelihoods. Here's a really simple example. I don't need to tell you that fossil-fueled vehicles in New Zealand are one of New Zealand's biggest sources of carbon emissions. So understanding why some people don't want to have cars is pretty important. And interestingly, there's a significant portion of younger people who are choosing not to drive or have a car. A few years ago, we did a study for the Ministry of Transport comparing one group of young people who had a strong car culture with others who weren't interested. The car culture group obviously had cars and driver's licence, and driving was their default choice, for mobility. And they spoke about their cars as giving them freedom and independence, and they often disdained other modes. The other group, who'd chosen not to get a licence or own a car, used many ways to get around, which we call multi-mobility. The transport involved quite different material items: bus passes, rain jackets, walking shoes, bikes, skateboards. And to get around, they walked, biked, took buses, used Ubers, and sometimes shared rides with their mates or family. Many were concerned about climate change, and for many, sharing was an important part of their life. But to our surprise, this group shared the same norms of freedom and independence as the car culture group, except they felt freer and more independent without a car. So here we see two distinct mobility cultures with quite different implications for carbon emissions. But choosing not to own a car can be hard for most of us because there are many influences beyond an individual's control that can reinforce the domination of car culture. These include things like past investments in motorways, advertising campaigns from car and SUV manufacturers, and government policies, including things like urban form. We call these external influences on a culture. I'm now going to talk through a few examples of research that use the cultures framework to explore why culture can be so hard to change. This research in Zambia looked at why the government and NGOs found it hard to persuade households to replace their charcoal stoves with other low-cost cooking methods. The charcoal stoves cause respiratory problems, especially amongst women and children, and also demand for charcoal causes widespread deforestation, and because of this, it's getting harder to obtain and it's quite costly for families. But families didn't want to change away from their charcoal stoves. Using the cultures framework, the study found that the traditional stove not only made food taste delicious, but also enabled everyday social interactions and allowed people to efficiently do other household chores alongside their cooking. Because of this, it isn't just a question of a straightforward swap of one technology for another. The charcoal stove is an integral part of culture, so high charcoal price and the availability of alternatives aren't enough to trigger change. I'm emphasising here those linking arrows. Here's another very different study, and do have a look at the name of the study. How many admirals does it take to change a light bulb? This one looked at why US Navy warships weren't adopting LED lights, even though this had been part of their strategy for at least 10 years. The research revealed aspects of the Navy's norms, materiality, and practices that interacted together to support the existing inefficient and costly lighting system. This included beliefs about energy being efficient, being cheap and abundant, and the Navy mission being war, not efficiency. And material aspects like existing fixtures and their maintenance requirements, and various practices such as acquisition processes and officer rotation. The study also identified a whole lot of external influences that effectively maintained this culture right up to the levels of federal government and congressional processes. Together, this system of interlocked cultural influences was preventing the Navy from making a very simple change to LED lights that would be cheaper because they're longer lasting and require far less energy. We've also used the cultures framework at a much broader scale, looking at why nations have such very different decarbonisation pathways. This is my grandchild just leaving. That's probably the best part of the show over and done with. Yeah, so this was work that I worked with a couple of international colleagues, and we looked at using the cultures framework to look at why nations had such very different decarbonisation pathways. And this cultural analysis helped us see how government-level norms, materiality, and practices had cemented over time. So we looked at a temporal view of culture there, resulting in a very, very different national-level commitments to moving away from fossil fuels. So the cultures framework is doing several things that make it useful as an analytical tool. Firstly, it takes an actor-centred perspective. That is, when we analyse, we're looking at the cultural dynamics of this group of people or that organisation or that sector. And it doesn't just focus on those three stones, the materiality, norms and practices, but how these interact and tend to reinforce each other, including through the forms of knowledge and language. And particularly what this means for the sustainability issues that we're interested in. The dotted circle invites us to think about the agency that the actors have. That is, to what extent does this person or organisation have power to change the unsustainable aspects of their culture? Inside the ring are those aspects of culture that the actor may have the ability to change under their own steam, and outside the rings are things that shape their culture, but the actor doesn't have too much likelihood of changing on their own. Also, the framework helps us think about how culture acts at many scales, because many of those external influences are cultural in their own right, but with a much bigger scope of influence. This helps us think about how power relations are implicit in culture. If we keep travelling up scales of cultural influence, we eventually get to long-standing Western ideologies that are the fundamental cause of the sustainability crisis, such as the growth paradigm, the belief that endless consumptive growth is possible and indeed essential. And another of these problematic ideologies, the belief that people are separate from and have dominion over nature. Many other cultures, and particularly Indigenous cultures, do not share these beliefs, and I'm sure that many of you in the room don't either. But these ideologies have formed tight cultural alignments with practices and materiality and are conveyed through particular forms of language and knowledge systems to underpin dominant global economic systems. Unpicking long-standing ideologies such as this would be the most effective way to bring about radical sustainable change, but extremely difficult given the powerful actors they serve. Let's now look at culture and change. The framework can also be used to help understand cultural change and its role in sustainability transitions. While culture, as you have seen, is often pretty much self-replicating and hard to change, cultures do and can change over time. Sometimes one seemingly tiny change to one cultural element can have a really big impact on other aspects of culture and thereby on the sustainability outcomes. This can be triggered internally, that is something initiated by the actor, or externally. And I'm going to start with an example of an external trigger. This example is from research led by Sarah Walton in the management department here and some others at the Centre for Sustainability. They were asked by Australia Aid to evaluate the success of an initiative in Vanuatu to make solar-powered lamps more easily affordable for communities that had no electricity. Until then, households had used kerosene lamps, which were expensive, messy, dangerous, caused indoor pollution, and generated carbon emissions. Usually households had only one because of the expense, and this tended to be managed and used by the males. Then AusAid offered a subsidy to suppliers, which meant that solar lamps became widely available. When households started to acquire and use these lamps, which could be charged in the sun every day, a whole lot of practices started to change. They were cheap, safe, and easy to run, so households got more than one. Women and children could use them and could do things like homework and weaving in the long evenings. They supported more socialising after dark and evening activities like fishing. There was less need to work in the cash economy as they didn't have to buy kerosene. This led to new norms and beliefs, such as lights being for everyone, not just for males, sunlight being made by God and therefore trustworthy, and an aversion to ever returning to kerosene. This growing trust in sunlight led to new aspirations for other solar appliances, such as small solar panels. This meant people could have mobile phones because they could now charge them. This is a great example of a cultural change with important sustainability gains for health, women's livelihoods, education, and environment, although there will, of course, be issues with plastic waste, as the lamps will have a limited life. So it's not a completely positive story. What it illustrates well, though, is how there can be cascading changes to culture from what seems like a small change in the first instance. We can see this in another very different example, This is again Sarah Walton's research. She used the cultures framework to investigate businesses that had improved their energy efficiency. Some of these businesses had started their journey with a material change, such as replacing a machine that had broken down with a more efficient one, which then led to changes in practices and norms. Some of them started with changes in practices, such as adopting lean manufacturing as a business policy, and this led to consequential changes to their norms and their materiality. And some started with changes to their norms, like wanting to appeal to the growing market for eco-products, and this led to changes in materiality and practices, what they produced and how they did it. In this sense, culture acts quite like a complex adaptive system, with one change leading to others, sometimes in predictable ways and sometimes in seemingly unpredictably with unintended consequences. For example, when people put in heat pumps, which are very energy efficient, households surprisingly often end up using more power than with their old resistive heaters. This makes engineers scratch their heads disapprovingly and call this the rebound effect or the Jevons paradox. But it's not paradoxical whatsoever. Through the cultures lens, we can see that norms and practices around heating have changed as they've become accustomed to being warmer, probably very sensibly if they're living in a typical New Zealand house. But consequential change doesn't always occur. Even if people want to change, they may be locked into their current pattern because of internally conflicting norms. The two-colour box of norms indicates that people can have different aspirations that don't necessarily align. For example, they want to reduce their travel-related carbon emissions on the one hand, but they feel they should drive their children to school for safety reasons on the other. So, nothing changes. And external influences, such as streets being unsafe for kids cycling, might also lock them in. We can be unhappy or uncomfortable with our culture, but stuck in it. This is where changes to external influences becomes critically important. Continuing with the example of personal transport, there are many changes that can be made to external influences that can help change our mobility culture. And recent examples are the EV rebate scheme and the increase in cycling infrastructure, both driven by policy changes at central and local government levels. Policy isn't the only external influence by any means, but it is an important one. In the Energy Cultures project, we used a cultural analysis as the basis for developing policy advice for more sustainable energy and transport. By looking at existing cultures, we could see cultural traits that had the latent ability to drive change in a more sustainable direction. So things that people had but weren't able to express because they had conflicting norms, possibly. And by analysing external influences on those cultures, we could see where they were already driving change in the right direction and where they were preventing or slowing change. From this, we could recommend alteration of existing policies that were blocking change or driving change in the wrong direction, as well as new policies to support latent cultural change for more sustainable outcomes. From this, we produced a number of two-page policy briefs aimed at busy public servants. And it's pleasing to see that a number of our recommendations have been implemented in some form, but whether as a direct result of these, it's very hard to tell. Cultural change can also happen as a result of a completely unexpected event. COVID was astonishingly successful in changing mobility practices by people having to work from home, use video conferencing, and constraining international travel. But some of those changes go beyond just a temporary shift in practices and appear to be now becoming normalised, like ongoing high use of Zoom meetings. And these have been cemented through material changes, such as setting up home offices and investment in video conferencing facilities. But what's most exciting to me is when we see cultural change massing up and breaking through the agency barrier, this dotted line here, and reshaping the forces that usually constrain us from change. Here's an example. As recently as 5 years ago, almost every major player in the New Zealand electricity sector, they're all here, were giving reasons why households should not be adopting PV, that is, solar generation. The government, Smart Grid Forum, lines companies, electricity retailers, Electricity Authority, Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority, a who's who of the electricity sector. But we were curious about why households were still adopting PV despite all of this external pushback. Our research found that PV aligned with a whole lot of Kiwi aspirations, even if it ended up being a bit more expensive than grid power for some people. Aspirations like a desire for independence, lack of trust in electricity companies, wanting greater financial control, environmental concern, and so forth. And what happened was that more and more households kept on adopting PV. And eventually, this broke down the dominant belief by the electricity sector that Kiwis shouldn't be doing this. They're doing it. This acceptance by the sector has driven changes right across the entire sector to accommodate and support decentralised power like PV, and these changes are still ongoing. Not perfectly yet, but we're getting there. So the sector's beliefs and desire to continue business as usual, i.e. their culture, were no match for the widespread shift in energy culture amongst the households. This kind of change gives me most hope for a sustainability transition. That is where isolated cultural shifts mass up and break through that agency barrier to reshape entire sectors. Another example is the rapid normalisation of divestment from fossil fuels, from a seemingly symbolic action by a handful of organisations, mainly universities, and this University of Otago was one of these only 6 years ago, to a core part of the rapidly growing responsible investment sector today. By over $14 trillion has already been shifted from the fossil fuel industry to date, much of this by major banks and fund managers. Another example is the rapid shift from the keep it in the ground message as a protest movement only 5 years ago to this being now the strong message from the highly influential International Energy Agency. If you look around in the media and amongst people that you know, you'll start to notice examples of how collective cultural shifts are starting to reshape wider systems of production towards more sustainable outcomes. And an example is the increase in veganism and vegetarianism. The cultures framework helps us understand culture, but it also opens our eyes to the value of different cultural understandings. It pleases me enormously to see the increasing influence of ways of thinking that challenge the fundamental Western ideologies that got us into this mess in the first place. For example, Māori principles, such as those described in this book in 2010, are not only embedded into Māori businesses such as Whale Watch and Kaikoura, but are now starting to reshape how other sectors think about their relationship with and responsibilities to the natural world. And just one example is this 2020 report from the Primary Sector Council, which outlines a new approach for our food and fibres sector based on Māori principles and partnerships. At this stage, it is just a tiny step in the think aspect of cultural change, and possibly some way from influencing what farmers really do and think and make. But it is a start. More generally, I believe that Te Ao Māori principles and mātauranga have a huge potential to underpin Aotearoa's sustainability journey. With concepts such as kaitiakitanga, responsibility for and reciprocity with the place that you live in, tangata ora, taio ora, the integral links between a healthy environment and healthy people, and the need for decision-making to always focus on future generations. To conclude, I want to first acknowledge the many people who've contributed to the development, testing and refinement of the Cultures Framework. The Energy Cultures team where it all started, other researchers here at Otago and around the world, postgraduate students here and internationally, including a number that I've supervised, and many people giving feedback in my seminars, workshops and conference presentations with academic and lay audiences. And I also acknowledge the many other cultural academics whose work has inspired me and on which I've built. Thank you all. You've helped make something quite special, I think, a theory and an analytical approach which helps reveal the critically important role of culture in sustainability transitions. The Cultures Framework has been described as having a deceptive simplicity. It's about as simple as you can get. What I especially like about it is that it can be used as a tool for thinking by anyone at all, as well as used academically to explore deeply complex issues. I hope it helps you to think about the culture that you're part of, for example, in your home life, your work life, and your wider social life. And maybe to consider where you or your organisation is stuck in an unsustainable cultural dynamic and the potential for change. If there are external influences that are preventing you, can you band together with others to alter them? Or are you part of a dominant culture which makes it hard for others to change? Importantly, can you be part of a massing up of cultural change that might become transformational? Reflecting on my journey to this point, I can see how the learnings I spoke about at the start have somehow found expression in the development, use, and application of the cultures framework. I didn't realise this until after I'd written the whole talk, and prompted by Etienne, who kindly had listened to a trial run. He's right, of course. It's all there. It feels like a full circle. To finish, I want to come back to my starting point, the world in crisis, and the role of the university, and the gleam of the possible. Despite my notes of hope, we have a massive task ahead to restore the planet to a safe place for humanity and other living things. We have very little time, and every fraction of a degree warming that we can avoid is critical. If we as a university are not actively working to be part of the solution, we are the problem. Every discipline can and should contribute. We have an extraordinary depth of discipline-specific knowledge that can be put to work for the sustainability transition. But academics have traditionally been rewarded for reductive, abstract, fragmented, and inwardly focused scholarship. We need to learn new ways of working that are better fit for complex problems, approaches that are integrative, interdisciplinary, accessible, and externally engaged. We also need to ensure that all of our students graduate with the knowledge and skills needed to take their part in constructing a sustainable future. And finally, we need to look to our own cultures as research groups, departments, divisions, and the university as a whole to unpick how we are replicating business as usual and to rebuild our cultures so that they will deliver a just and sustainable world. Ka huri, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Jessica Palmer ahau, ko te manakura o te Kite Aranui ahau, a te whare wānanga tēnei. It's my great pleasure, Janet, to give you the vote of thanks tonight. And in doing so, I want to comment on two characteristics of your research that you demonstrated fully in your lecture, and that I think it's important for us as a community to say bravo to you for and to be reminded of how important they are. So the first characteristic that I think it's worth emphasising is that for you, the value of your research is that it responds so directly to the communities in which you find yourself, and that you are absolutely passionate about ensuring that your research matters to the people and communities that you're in. And that, in PBRF speak, equals impact. And so university managers like that. But more importantly, we as people need to acknowledge that and say thank you. Thank you that you care so much about your communities. You mentioned that your journey here has been perhaps unorthodox. And I think maybe that's true. But I wondered too if, in fact, actually, that journey was essential. Because what you bring to us in this community is a reminder constantly that our research must matter to the communities in which we find ourselves. Otherwise, we are in danger of just remaining in ivory towers. So thank you for that. And secondly, Janet, I think you have demonstrated really clearly here the value of an interdisciplinary approach. And you've emphasised for us or introduced to us the problem of the sustainability crisis, and you've shown us how it's not just a problem of hard or physical science, but it's very much a problem of social science. And I just think it's wonderful that you've brought that to this lecture and that you bring that to your research. And your important contribution in particular is that whole question and answer of saying this is a problem of culture as much as it is a problem of geology and weather and all sorts of things that we hear. The physical scientists tell us we have to appreciate it's a problem of culture. And you've developed a framework that beautifully simple and yet deeply meaningful. It explains how culture works. It explains how culture can change. I was chatting to a family member this afternoon who asked me what I was doing this evening, and I said, I'm coming along to an IPL. What's the area? Oh, sustainability. And he said, what is sustainability doing within the Division of Humanities? And I think you've demonstrated that beautifully, actually. In my opinion, you have demonstrated the strength of the humanities scholar at work tonight. You have drawn us in to reflect on what it is to be a member of the various societies and communities in which we make our place of standing. How have we come to this place, this way of thinking, this way of behaving, and the assumptions that we have? And how might we contribute to the community to which we belong? So bravo, thank you so much, Janet. Thank you for providing us with a window into your world of research, and thank you for causing us to think and to reflect. I have the great pleasure, just stepping back here for a second. Do I have that pleasure? Of presenting you with a gift. Play a bit of hide and seek here. I'll give you the gift later. Oh no, there it is. I have the great pleasure of presenting you this gift as a sign of our appreciation for this evening, but more importantly for the years of work that you have put in. So bravo, thank you. So Janet, we say to you, whakamihi, ahorangi Janet, tēnā koe. And my last job for this evening is to thank you all for coming and to invite you warmly to come and share with us. Haere mai e hoa, mō te kaputi, mō te kai, mō te manaakitaka. And we're going to head over to the staff club for those of you who are able. Thank you very much for coming.